Hey, George Haas here. We've been talking quite a bit about ultimate reality versus conceptual reality, the five types of phenomena, the four aspects of phenomena, and I thought maybe it would be useful to consider practice in this. Um, as householders, we want to be able to organize our practice in such a way that it's engaging to us as householders. Um, this minute exploration of these various aspects may not be conducive to a typical householder practice. Uh, the description of it is often uh, in these traditional ways intended for monastics. And so we need to be able to adapt practice in such a way that it's useful for our engaged lives. We're out in the world, attending to worldly things. So I thought that describing a way of practicing this piece, coming into mindfulness, the first piece then would be to engage in this process of ultimate reality, the exploration of the sensing experience itself. In a traditional way of characterizing that, we would be looking at each of the five senses and thinking on top of that. And then considering that as the first foundation of mindfulness, or the first pasture of mindfulness. And then adding to that Vedana. Vedana is the Pali word for feeling tones, which is the quality of the sensing experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The technique that I mostly recommend that people use to begin to explore this is a see, hear, feel technique that comes from Shinzen Young's teaching. And so we're dividing broadly the sensing experiences into three categories instead of five. Visual experience, both external and internal. Audio experience, both external and internal. The felt sense of the body as it interacts with the world, including taste and smell, and the corporal sense of the body, and also emotion. In a Karnika Samadhi, or momentary concentration insight practice, we let our attention be drawn to whatever is interesting, and then we soak into the experience, and then we come out and know what that experience is. So in the case of exploring ultimate experience through the first and second foundations at the same time, we would be engaged in a double noting. So the first note would be for sensory clarity. It is in an aspect of a visual experience, an aspect of auditory experience, or is it an aspect of the felt sense of the body? And then the second note is whether the sensing experience itself is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral in the sensing. So there's nothing beyond that in this initial investigation. We want to touch into the nature of sensing. We know from neuroscience that conscious awareness there's a lag between what actually happens and our experience of it. So in mind time, conscious awareness runs about a half a second behind what actually happens. And a half a second in brain time is quite a long time. We also know that urgent or difficult or dangerous experience is processed before pleasant experience, maybe 3/8 of a second to process something that's considered urgent, a half a second to process something that's considered pleasant. We know that the urgent material supersedes everything in the queue for processing, so that we can get into these negative jags sometimes in the mind. If conscious awareness is a half a second behind what happens due to the lag in processing speed, and we don't notice it, that's because there's this sort of smoothing over that the mind does, so that we have the experience that things are unfolding as they happen, even though that they've happened already a half a second earlier. That's why, for instance, you can't play tennis from the present moment. From the present experience, because if you do, by the time you swing the racket, the ball has already gone by. You have to come out of conscious awareness into the unconscious, into the no self, and play from there. Sometimes they call that playing in the zone. So what often happens to us is that the processing of the experience completes before it enters into conscious awareness, and the sensing experience has already been identified and fixated as a particular pattern of sensory experience, and all of the conditioning that we have associated with it also attaches. So it comes into consciousness as a fixated solid object with all of its sundry meanings attached to it. So in our exploration, we're intentionally looking to soak in beyond the conventional fixation into the ultimate sensing experience. By means of explaining what I just said, what that means is that we don't need to catch everything as it happens. We need to be available to catch the things that are easy and obvious. This is one of the aspects of mindfulness. We know from inferential insight that we also don't need to capture everything. We can begin to focus on the individual aspects, the individual threads of experience that when we zoom out form the tapestry, the image on the tapestry. But we can explore individually these different sensory experiences, and then from inferential insight know that if the broad experience, the zoomed out experience is happening, and we're zoomed in on one of the threads of it, that the other threads must be there in order for that pattern of experience to be happening. So in Vipassana, V means to divide, Passana means to see. We go through a process of teasing apart the experience that happens by its individual threads, and then come out and look at the whole picture. We go into the sensing experience and then come out into what we've made the sensing experience into. We're not looking in this investigation around sensing experience, around ultimate reality, for the aspects of mind or the aspects of dhammas that we might explore, or truths that we might explore about that. We're really limiting ourselves to just the sensing experience itself, so that to know that that's a visual experience is enough. We don't need to know the content of visual experience. To know that it's an auditory experience is enough. We don't need to know the content of the audio. To know that it's a felt experience in the body is enough. We don't need to know what the content of that felt experience is. So the see, hear, feel technique is done by these broad divisions. So exterior sight, the seeing sense of the world outside. Internal visual thinking. There's, for most people, a mental screen centered here in front of the eyes, at the eyes, maybe slightly behind depending on your conditioning. A blank screen where you see the imagery associated with visual thinking. So there's often sort of a dull gray scale happening, maybe sometimes a little bit of color on the screen, which is mostly there, mostly accessible, and then imagery appears on that. What we want to know is where our attention is. So if it were on the screen, even if there wasn't imagery, that would be a visual experience, or see is the label for that. There's also the visual aspect of the outline of the body in its current position. Some people report a dark center with a glowy edge. Some people report a rapid assemblage of snapshots of the body arranged so that we know how the body is currently positioned. There's the location of the body in the current environment that's typically looking out. So the view looking out, which we carry inside in internal visual thinking as a reference. Whether our eyes are open or closed, we know where we are in the space. There's the aspect of visual thinking that reacts to local sensation in the body. It's part of the proprioceptus system, which is the way that we're aware of how the body is positioned, a constant feedback between visual experience and the felt sense of the body. Then there's an image reaction to exterior sound. So we hear a sound, and often there's an image that appears in the mind that identifies the sound. So those aspects, external and internal visual thinking, we use the single generic label C to represent. In auditory experience, there's the exterior sound, so the sound of the landscape around us. And then there's also internal auditory thinking. Some people will be aware in the space where they hear internal auditory thinking a subtle vibratory activity. And if you become concentrated on that, what you'll know is the cognition for the clear talk of the mind will precede the talk itself. So we use the label here to represent auditory experience. And then the felt sense of the body, the temperature on the body, the aspect of gravity on the body, the heaviness of the body, respiration, digestion, the efforting to hold a posture, all of those sensations are available in the body. And then also the emotional content of the body. We use the label feel for that. So we have a noting and labeling distinction. Noting is where you let your attention be drawn to a sensing experience, you soak into the sensing experience, and then you know what that is. So it's this back and forth, sensing, knowing, sensing, knowing, sensing, knowing. We're often scattered. Often our periods of practices are relatively short, 5, 10, 25 minutes, an hour maybe. And so adding to that a labeling process where you generate in auditory thinking, the label tends to give concentration a turbo boost. So you know where your attention is, you soak into the sensing experience, and then you generate the label in auditory thinking space that corresponds to the sensing experience that you're having. In Karnika Samadhi, momentary concentration insight practice, we really want to zoom in and focus narrowly on individual sensing experiences rather than moving into a wide open awareness of what's happening. In momentary concentration practice, we really need only to be concentrated in the moment of noting a particular experience. So in the beginning of this kind of practice, you momentarily concentrate and then relax the concentration, and then momentarily concentrate and then relax the concentration. So that's also a pushing in and relaxing, pushing in and relaxing. As the noting practice continues, we tend to develop a flow of concentration, and that the relaxing periods become more and more concentrated until we're in a state that is equivalent to a continuous concentration that you might develop through the tranquility side of the practice. With the noting practice, you have choices about whether to do just a freely moving strategy or a rhythmic noting strategy. There's an upside and downside to each of these. In the freely moving strategy, you simply let your attention be drawn to whatever is interesting, and you hang out as long as there's interest, and then as the mind moves you to the next object of meditation, the next sensing experience, you note where your attention moves to. The upside of that is that you can really soak in deeply to the sensing experience. The downside is that you can get spaced out and be thinking for long periods of time without recognizing, because there's nothing to stop that from happening. The rhythmic noting strategy is you develop an internal metronome, and each time it clicks, wherever your attention is in that moment, you note it, you label it. So you're engaged in the noting process. The letting your attention be drawn to something, soaking in, knowing what it is, soaking in, knowing what it is. And then when the moment for rhythmic noting happens, you label wherever your attention is in that moment. The upside of that way of practicing is that you tend to be spaced out for shorter periods of time because you miss the labeling, and that brings your attention back. The downside is that the labeling can become robotic and detached from what you're actually sensing. Still, the rhythmic aspect of the noting brings you back to investigate whether that's happening or not, but you can get caught up in the labeling just being robotic without actually corresponding to what you're sensing. There's no real preference between the two. It's whichever one works best for you. So in a formal period of practicing, looking to investigate ultimate reality, we would be engaged in sitting down for a period of time, usually useful to determine the length of time that you're going to sit and stay on the cushion or a chair for as long as you've intended. You make a decision about the technique that you're going to do. If this is the technique you're going to do, then that would be the decision. The only time you would change technique during that period of meditation is if the object of meditation that you choose was no longer available to you. There was an opportunity to explore something in meditation that you're interested in exploring but is not always available, or something comes up in the meditation that needs immediate attention. So Shinzen calls that ion, interest, opportunity, necessity. And then you would begin your technique. Settle the body in, coming into a balanced posture that you can hold still for the period of sitting, and then begin the technique. I tend to like a rhythmic noting strategy, and that's the one that I use, noting wherever my attention is at the end of the out-breath. And I'll do a little now so you have a sense of how the technique would sound, labeling vocally. So settling into a meditation posture, and then beginning the technique. First noting for sensory clarity, and then noting for the quality of the sensing experience. C neutral, C neutral, C neutral, feel neutral, hear neutral, hear neutral. You get the idea. Thank you.